Hi everybody, it's Paul Raye from Think Accountants here, and this morning I'm talking to Andrew McLellan. He's the director of EDX, and they're experts in the Personal Property Securities Register. So Andrew, perhaps you can start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And Paul and I do go back a long way. I first met Paul when I was an insolvency practitioner. I was a partner of a national insolvency firm for 20 years. I left about 10 years ago at the time that a new piece of legislation was introduced called the Personal Property Securities Register, the PPSR, and I've been doing that now for 10 years. And it's a bit of legislation where insolvency's background is actually quite useful.
So why is the PPSR so important, Andrew?
Okay, so it's what it is, and it takes a little bit of a brief explanation. In 2012, new legislation was introduced called the Personal Property Securities Register, and it's a bit of a carrot and stick legislation. The carrot will be that if you register because you should be registering, you'll get a lot of benefits. But if you don't register, there's a big stick at the end of it. And it works pretty simply like this. You own an asset. That asset is not with you, it's with someone else at the time. You will not be able to recover your asset if the person who has your asset goes insolvent. Now, that's probably about the most basic general explanation in a user-friendly language I can give, and I'll give you some examples. The most work I do would be in what we call retention of title. So if you sell goods on credit, you'll be selling them under your terms of trade, which have that magical clause, retention of title. Ownership doesn't pass until payment's been received in full. And that's exactly what it is. You still own the goods that you are selling until your customer has paid for them. If you don't register that relationship on the PPSR and your customer goes broke, you have very little rights. You can't get your stock back. There's nothing more you can do except probably vote for the liquidator's fees at the creditor's meeting. But if you do register that customer on the PPSR, you get a lot of benefits. The first one being the retention of title clause can now be valid. That is, ownership hasn't passed till payment's been received in full. So you can go to the insolvency practitioner and say, I'm unpaid for all this stock. I would either like it back or could you please pay me for it? And invariably, the insolvency practitioner will just cut a check and pay you for it. So by registering, you can get your stock back. If you're owed, say, $100,000 when your customer goes broke, but there's only $60,000 stock there, well, you're still $60,000 ahead. But if you can see that the unpaid $40,000 is in the trade debtors of your insolvent customer, you can even get paid from trade debtors. 2 bites at the cherry. The third benefit is you get immunity from an unfair preference action from the liquidator. And if you've been on the one end of one of those, you'll know how horrible that is. And the fourth reason is that if your customer goes to sell their business, they can't sell their business until your registration has been removed. And you'll only remove it because you've been paid in full. That is pretty much why you'd want to register on the PPSR if you sell goods on credit, which is the bulk of the work that I do. The other areas that would affect people who should be registering are those who engage in what we call long-term hire. Long-term being over 2 years. So if you're hiring, leasing, financing assets and the duration of that lease or hire is over 2 years, then you need to register on the PPSR because, again, if you don't register and the borrower goes broke, even though you own the assets under lease or hire, you have lost them to the liquidator. And there's been some pretty horrible cases where people owed millions thinking that they were still the owner of their assets. They didn't register or they didn't register correctly, and they've lost millions of dollars. The third area is what we call asset protection. If you've got one company that owns the assets, another entity that trades with the assets, you need to register that on the PPSR because that's a hire of over 2 years. And the fourth area I do work in is just registering loans. So if you're lending money and you have security for that loan, again, if the borrower goes broke, you've got no security if you haven't registered or at least registered correctly on the PPSR. There's a lot of things I do in the area, but that normally kickstarts most of the work that I do if you're in those 4 categories.
So Andrew, registering on the PPSR, if I was to want to do that myself, is it a difficult exercise? What would it cost me? And how hard would it be for me to get it wrong? Or how easy would it be for me to get it wrong?
It's pretty easy to get it wrong. It is a difficult exercise, and for anyone who's had to go on the government PPSR website, if you don't know what you're doing, it is difficult and clunky, and that's just because of the legislation itself. It's quite complex. We understand it. It's very difficult to do it without making a mistake, and if I wanted to pull a figure out of the air, 90% of the people we've ever seen try to do this themselves will get it wrong. So what we do is we do the registrations for them, and we then data manage those registrations. And I know, if you're thinking of doing 1 or 2 registrations, try doing 100, 500, 1,000, 10,000. I've got a client with 100,000 registrations. I've got a client with 1 registration, and we do it all for them because it is really easy to get it wrong. And one slight mistake, and your registration's invalid, and you've wasted your money. The good thing is, though, it's not expensive. When we register the customer under the retention of title example, you do 1 registration every 7 years. Not every invoice, not every transaction, just once every 7 years. It's $6 to register on the PPSR. So it's not a big investment to make, usually in relation to the assets that you are trying to protect. I don't know one accounting firm that would actually do registration work because it's just dangerous. It's not worth it for the fees and the risk involved. And again, to pull another figure out of the air, I'd say 4 out of 5 legal firms don't touch this space for the same reason. They will do all the legal work, but as far as just doing that final registration, it's just not worth them trying to do it. Understand 333 pages of legislation to do a registration. We do it for them and data manage it for them.
So Andrew, just to clarify, so it's really registering the customer. That's right. It's not registering every invoice. Is that correct?
Yes, there's examples of both. Most of my work is registering the customer. That is the bulk of the work that I do. However, there are certain assets that you can register individually, and I do a lot of that too, and that's motor vehicles. You can register a motor vehicle, watercraft, and aircraft by its serial number, and that gives you another powerful tool. So I do a lot of motor vehicle registrations, invariably by the VIN number of the motor vehicle, and it gives you the same protection that I was talking about before. Motor vehicle financiers register each vehicle by its own serial number because that registration will follow the vehicle wherever it goes. And again, no one's going to buy that vehicle until the PPSR registration has been removed. So if you're a financier, it's comforting to know that registration is going to follow the vehicle. If anyone does try to sell it, on hire it, lease it, they're not going to until they get the registration removed, of which the financier, again, I'm happy to remove it, please pay me out. So it's good protection. You can't serially number registered plant and equipment or goods that you're selling on credit. So all my work for serial numbered registrations is just on the motor vehicle itself.
Andrew, you touched on earlier about a pretty normal practice of having small business in particular having a separate company for asset protection, holding their assets there. This is probably something that no one really, well, small businesses don't think about. Can you just explain a little bit more of just how they may be exposed?
Yeah, look, it's a really common structure. It's a common structure that's been going on for 50 years or more. And that's where a business operates not through one entity, but 2 entities. And the logic is this: one entity will own the very valuable motor vehicles, plant and equipment, assets, land and buildings. Another entity will trade with those assets. And the trading entity, it'll probably buy the stock, it'll own the trade debtors, but it won't actually own all the valuable plant and equipment and motor vehicles. And the reason for doing that is invariably asset protection. Because if the trading entity fails, at least all of the plant and equipment, motor vehicles and assets are safe in a separate entity. That's largely the logic to it. It's really common. In fact, with motor vehicles, big motor vehicle companies, I've never not seen it set out that way. Now, that has been a terrific asset protection strategy up until the date the PPSR was introduced. because up until then, if the trading entity failed, they are assets in a separate entity and they're safe. Because that's more than a 2-year long-term hire, it then gets captured by the PPSR. So if the trading entity fails, and there's a lot of examples of this, the liquidator of the trading entity becomes the proud owner of all the assets owned by that separate entity because it wasn't registered on the PPSR, the arrangement.
So how would we go about registering that? Do we have to register all those assets, or do we just register the relationship in some way?
Really simple. We can make that compliant in a day. And the way we do that is, one, we do always need a written agreement as to what this relationship is. So we enter into a lease. The second thing is it's invariably just 2 registrations and for 25 years. So we register all the motor vehicles, all the plant and equipment, which is invariably every single asset that is in the asset owning entity. That's just 2 registrations. We can register each motor vehicle by its serial number, but that exercise is not for that purpose. It's just to make that asset protection structure what we call PPSR compliant. We enter into a lease, we do 25-year registrations, and in 2046, Paul, we worry about it then.
Okay, well, I think, as I say, that's a pretty common scenario. So for the sake of a few $100s, you could protect yourself there and, as you say, 25 years. So that's something I think, all small businesses with that sort of structure really need to take seriously on board.
And it allows for asset movements too. So over the next 25 years, as assets will invariably come and go from the asset owning entity to the trading entity, nothing has to happen. I'll keep a copy of the lease and the registration. The accountant, Paul, will keep a copy. The client keeps a copy, and you just need to produce it over the next 25 years. But it really is a set and forget once you've done it. And much of the PPSR is that set and forget, get it compliant, make sure it's done correctly, and not worry about it again until the client, if they do fail, you've got your paperwork there.
All right, Andrew, look, it sounds like, it's a pretty scary, some pretty scary potential scenarios there, but something that can be, reasonably, relatively easily put in place and take that worry of people's, take that right away from them. So thank you very much. And how could, what's the best way for someone to get in touch with you, having seen this video that thinks I need to speak to Andrew?
Just call me, email me, and it's same day service. We can correct it all. Okay, it's pretty quick. We know what to do, how to do it quickly, efficiently. And we do get people urgently wanting to do this, Paul, the registrations and all the rest. And the thing is, you don't get any past protection. And we've seen people call us, oh, Andrew, you need to register this customer. They're about to go broke or they've gone broke. Too late. There's no past protection. You've got to get it in place before anything goes wrong. Otherwise, you're just going to get caught. So don't leave it to the last minute, a bit of planning.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We'll include your details at the end of the video. So people that do need to get in touch will be able to get in touch with you. So thanks again, and thanks everybody for listening.